Marcus jolted awake as the landing gear deployed, his heart pounding against his ribs. He looked down at his frayed white collar and froze. A smear of crimson lipstick, bright as fresh blood, was stamped right over his heart. He reached up frantically to wipe it away, but a manicured hand grabbed his wrist. Elena, the CEO in the seat beside him, wasn't looking at him. She was reapplying the same shade of red with trembling fingers. "Don't touch it," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "That stain is the only proof that we just returned from our honeymoon." Marcus pulled back into his seat, his eyes darting from the crimson stain on his collar to the woman sitting next to him. The cabin of the first-class flight was silent, save for the soft hum of the engines, but inside Marcus's head, alarm bells were ringing deafeningly. He looked down at his hands, rough, calloused hands that had spent the last 10 years laying brick and pouring concrete, and then at the woman. She was the definition of elegance, draped in silk and smelling of expensive vanilla. But beneath the designer layers, she was vibrating with pure, unadulterated terror. "You're insane," Marcus rasped, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "I don't know who you are, lady, but I'm not playing any games. I need to get off this plane and go find a job." "You don't understand," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. She leaned in closer, the desperation in her eyes cutting through her composed facade. "The man waiting for me at the gate. Richard. He isn't just a fiancé, he's a predator. My father's company is collapsing, and I am the collateral. If I walk out those doors single, I am property. But if I walk out married," she gestured to the lipstick, "he can't touch me, not publicly, not yet." Marcus shook his head, reaching for his seatbelt buckle. This was a rich person's problem. He had his own war to fight. Just yesterday, his foreman had handed him a pink slip instead of a paycheck. He was flying back home on a non-refundable ticket he couldn't afford, heading to a hospital where his mother was fighting a battle against cancer that they were losing, not because of medicine, but because of money. As if on cue, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen was cracked, a spider web of glass over the display. He pulled it out. A notification from St. Mary's Hospital flashed in cruel, bright letters. "Payment declined. Insufficient funds. Immediate transfer required for continued treatment." The air left Marcus's lungs. He stared at the screen, the weight of his failure crushing him into the expensive leather seat. He was 28 years old, strong and willing to work, yet he couldn't keep the lights on for the woman who had given him life. Elena, with the sharp instincts of a woman who had spent her life negotiating survival, saw the look on his face. She saw the cracked phone. She saw the frayed cuffs of his shirt. She saw the despair. "I can help you," she said, her voice steadying. She reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook. "Whatever you need. 1,000? 10,000? Help me walk past Richard and I will write you a check that solves whatever problem is on that screen." It was the lifeline he had been praying for. It was the answer to his mother's prayers. All he had to do was lie. All he had to do was pretend to be this woman's husband for a few hours. But as Elena held the pen, her sleeve rode up slightly. It was a small movement, barely an inch, but it revealed something that stopped Marcus cold. There, on her delicate pale wrist, was a bruise. It wasn't fresh. It was a dark, ugly purple fading into yellow, the unmistakable mark of fingers grabbing too hard, of a grip meant to control and silence. Marcus looked from the checkbook to the bruise, and a cold fury settled in his gut. He knew that mark. He had seen it on his mother's arm years ago, before she had gathered the courage to leave his violent father. He knew exactly what kind of man Richard was without ever meeting him. Elena saw him looking. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, shame flushing her cheeks. "It doesn't matter," she stammered, misinterpreting his silence. "I can double the amount. 20,000. Please, I just need a prop." Marcus reached out, but not for the checkbook. He gently pushed her hand away, closing the leather cover of the booklet. "Put your money away," Marcus said, his voice low and firm. Elena's face fell. The light in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a hollow resignation. "I understand," she whispered, turning away. "I'm sorry to have bothered you. I'll handle it myself." She looked small then. Not a CEO, not a billionaire's daughter, just a scared woman preparing to walk into a cage. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up, smoothing down his wrinkled, cheap shirt with the lipstick stain burning on the collar. He looked down at her. "I said put the money away," Marcus repeated, softer this time. "I'm not a gigolo, and I don't sell my honor for a check." Elena looked up, confused. "But I'm also not going to let you walk out there alone with that bruise on your arm," Marcus said. He held out his hand, his rough, working man's hand, waiting for hers. "I don't care about your father's company, but if this Richard guy thinks he can hurt you, he's going to have to go through me first." Elena stared at his hand. For years, men had reached for her with greed, with lust, or with ownership. This was the first time a man had reached for her with nothing but simple human decency. Slowly, tremblingly, she placed her manicured hand in his. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus said, his jaw setting as the plane taxied to a halt. "Let's go meet your husband." The automatic doors slid open, and a wall of flashing lights and suffocating tension hit them instantly. Richard was standing right there, flanked by two bodyguards who looked more like hired muscle than security. Richard wasn't just handsome in a dangerous way, he was terrifying. His suit cost more than Marcus had made in his entire life, and his eyes scanned the crowd with the predatory focus of a wolf picking out a wounded deer. When he saw Elena, his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a possessive, cold smirk. He didn't wait for her to approach. He strode forward, ignoring the crowds, moving with an entitlement that made people step aside. "There she is," Richard boomed, reaching out to grab Elena's arm. It wasn't a gentle greeting. His fingers dug into the exact spot on her wrist where the bruise was hidden beneath her silk sleeve. Elena flinched, her breath hitching in a tiny, terrified gasp that only Marcus heard. "You're late," Richard hissed, leaning in close, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was meant only for her. "I told you to be the first one off. Do you want to embarrass me before we even start?" He pulled her, hard. Elena stumbled in her heels, looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter. But she didn't fall, because a hand, rough, scarred, and steady as a rock, clamped down on Richard's wrist. The lobby went silent. The bodyguards took a step forward, hands reaching into their jackets. Richard looked down at the hand touching him, then up at the man attached to it. He looked at Marcus's cheap, wrinkled shirt, his worn-out boots, and the defiant set of his jaw. He laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "Get your hands off me, trash," Richard sneered. "Who do you think you are, the baggage handler?" Marcus didn't let go. He didn't even blink. He looked Richard dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of frustration, every protective instinct he had honed protecting his mother from men just like this. "I'm her husband," Marcus said. His voice was calm, devoid of fear, and it carried a weight that cut through the noise of the airport. Richard froze. He looked at Elena, then back at Marcus. "Husband? Is this a joke, Elena? You picked up a stray dog to play house?" "It's not a joke." Marcus stepped in front of Elena, placing his broad shoulders between her and the threat. He reached out and gently adjusted Elena's coat, pulling it tighter around her shoulders as if shielding her from a cold wind. But his eyes never left Richard's. "My wife is tired," Marcus said, emphasizing the word wife like a weapon. "She's had a long flight, and she doesn't like being grabbed." He stepped closer, invading Richard's personal space, radiating a quiet, dangerous intensity that money couldn't buy. "So, unless you want to explain to airport security why you're assaulting a married woman," Marcus whispered, low enough that the bodyguards couldn't hear, "I suggest you step aside. Now." For a second, violence hung heavy in the air. Richard's face turned a shade of crimson, his ego bruising faster than any fist could manage. But he looked around. People were watching. Phones were out. He was trapped by his own public image. With a sneer of pure hatred, Richard took a step back, releasing his grip. "We'll see how long this lasts," Richard spat, buttoning his jacket. "Enjoy your little game, Elena, but remember who owns the board." He turned and stormed off, his entourage trailing behind him like angry shadows. Elena let out a breath she had been holding for 10 minutes. She looked up at Marcus's back, the broad, unmoving shield that had just stood against a hurricane for her. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers trembling. You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "Yes," he said simply, "I did. Now come on, let's get out of here." The dining room was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, cold enough to freeze water. Elena sat stiffly, her knuckles white as she gripped her fork. Across the table, her parents looked at Marcus not as a guest, but as a stain on their silk tablecloth. Richard was there too, nursing a glass of scotch, watching with a vulture's patience, waiting for the imposter to slip up. "So, Marcus," Elena's father began, slicing his steak with surgical precision. "My daughter tells us you're in consulting, a vague term. Tell me, which firm? What is your portfolio worth? We haven't seen your name on the Forbes list." The table went silent. This was the trap. One wrong lie, one checkable fact, and he was dead. Elena held her breath, ready to jump in with a rehearsed cover story. But Marcus didn't look at her father. He looked at the bowl of untouched soup in front of Elena. He noticed she hadn't taken a single bite because her hands were shaking too much to hold the spoon. "My portfolio isn't on a list, sir," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. He reached over, picked up the silver ladle, and gently poured a small amount of warm broth into Elena's bowl. He did it with the natural grace of someone who had spent years caring for a sick parent. "And my firm was a woman named Sarah, my mother." Richard snorted into his glass. "His mother? Is this a joke?" Marcus ignored him. He turned his attention to Elena's mother, who was looking at him with open disdain. "My mother cleaned houses for people like you for 30 years, Marcus said. The room dropped in temperature, but he pressed on. "She didn't leave me stocks or bonds, but she taught me that when a woman is trembling at a dinner table, you don't ask her about money. You make sure she eats." He carefully cut a small piece of bread and placed it on Elena's side plate. "Eat, Elena, you're pale." For the first time in her life, no one at that table had ordered Elena to do something for the family's image. Someone just wanted her to not be hungry. She looked at Marcus, tears pricking her eyes, and took a bite. "How quaint," her father sneered. "But kindness doesn't pay the shareholders, boy. We need assets. We need legacy." "Legacy?" A sharp, cracked voice cut through the air. It was Grandmother Rose, the matriarch who sat at the head of the table. She had been silent the entire meal, her eyes closed as if asleep. Now she opened them, fixing her gaze on Marcus. "You have rough hands, young man," she rasped. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus nodded respectfully. "Construction. Bricklaying." "Good!" She banged her cane on the floor. "Honest work keeps the blood warm." She turned her fierce gaze to Richard, then to her own son. "You all sit here counting your millions, discussing mergers, while my granddaughter looks like she's about to faint. And this bricklayer is the only one who noticed she hates mushrooms." Everyone looked down. Marcus had quietly moved the mushrooms from Elena's plate to his own while he was talking. A small, unnoticed detail. Grandmother Rose smiled, a rare expression that transformed her stern face. "It has been 40 years since I saw a man look at a woman in this family as a human being and not an ATM machine." She raised her glass to Marcus. "You may not have a portfolio, son, but you are the richest man at this table." The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing them inside the guest suite. The moment the lock engaged, the steel in Elena's spine snapped. She didn't just sit down, she collapsed onto the edge of the four-poster bed, burying her face in her hands. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Marcus stood by the door, unbuttoning his cuffs, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. He watched her shoulders shake, not with the polite, silent weeping she had done at dinner, but with harsh, jagged sobs of someone who had been holding their breath for a decade. Suddenly, Elena stood up. She rushed toward him, her eyes red and frantic. She grabbed a wet towel from the vanity basin on her way. "Take it off!" she demanded, her voice shrill. She reached for his collar, scrubbing furiously at the red lipstick stain on his chest. "I have to get it out! I have to fix it! I ruined everything! I dragged you into this hell and I ruined your clothes and I'm so sorry. Elena, stop, Marcus said, trying to step back. No, it won't come out. She was scrubbing harder now, her nails scratching his skin through the thin fabric, desperate to erase the evidence of her desperation. It's a cheap shirt. I'll buy you 10 new ones, I promise. Just let me... Marcus caught her wrists. He didn't squeeze, but he held them firm enough to stop her manic motion. It's not a cheap shirt, Marcus said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it stopped her dead. He looked down at the frayed fabric, now damp and wrinkled from her scrubbing. It's old, Marcus corrected her gently, but it's not cheap. My mother bought this for me 3 years ago. It was the last birthday gift she gave me before the chemo took her mind, before she forgot what day it was. He ran a thumb over a loose button. She saved for 2 months to buy it. She said she wanted me to look like a gentleman so the world would treat me like one. Elena's face crumpled. The horror of what she had done, using this sentimental treasure as a prop for her lie, washed over her. She pulled her hands back as if she had been burned. Oh my God, she whispered, stepping back. Marcus, I didn't know. I treated it like a rag. I'm just like them. I'm just like my family. No, Marcus shook his head. He walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling, manicured gardens that felt more like a prison yard. When I woke up on the plane and saw the mark, I was angry. I wanted to yell at you. I thought you were just another rich girl treating people like disposable napkins. He turned back to face her. The moonlight caught the side of his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. But then I saw your wrist, he said. And tonight, I saw how you look at that door, waiting for Richard to walk in. This stain? He pointed to his chest. It's not an insult, Elena. It was a flare. You were drowning, and you grabbed the only thing that could keep you afloat. I can't be mad at someone for trying to survive. Elena stared at him. For years, she had been surrounded by men who demanded perfection. Here was a man standing in a stained shirt, telling her that her mess was forgiven. You take the bed, Marcus said, grabbing a pillow and a blanket from the wardrobe. He began to arrange them on the rug near the fireplace. You can't sleep on the floor, Elena protested weakly. You're the husband. I'm the bricklayer, Marcus smiled, lying down and folding his hands behind his head. And this rug is softer than my mattress back in Queens. Go to sleep, Elena. I'm right here. No one is coming through that door tonight. Elena lay down, but her body was still wired, her mind replaying Richard's threats. She tossed and turned, the silence of the room amplifying her anxiety. Then, from the darkness of the floor, a melody began to rise. It wasn't a song with lyrics, it was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from his very chest. It was a wordless lullaby, the kind of ancient, soothing rhythm that a mother uses to calm a fever. Soft, steady, and unbroken, the sound filled the empty luxury of the suite, turning the cold air warm. Elena stopped moving. She listened to the sound of his breath between the notes. She focused on the steady presence of the man on the floor. For the first time in years, the knot in her chest loosened. The monsters at the door faded away, kept at bay by a barrier made of nothing but a simple, healing melody. Her breathing synchronized with his rhythm. Her eyes fluttered shut. And for the first time since she was a child, Elena didn't dream of running. She just slept. The morning sun didn't bring warmth, it brought a cold reckoning. Marcus stepped out of the guest suite, careful not to wake Elena, intending to find a kitchen to make her coffee. But he didn't make it to the hallway. Richard was leaning against the wall, waiting. He wasn't accompanied by his thugs this time. He was alone, holding a manila folder, and wearing a smile that was far more dangerous than his anger had been the night before. St. Mary's Hospital, Richard said, his voice casual as if discussing the weather. Oncology ward, room 402, patient, Sarah Miller. Marcus froze. The air left his lungs. He took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. If you go near her... Relax, bricklayer, Richard chuckled, tapping the folder against his palm. I don't need to go near her. I already own her. Or rather, my holding company acquired St. Mary's 6 months ago. He opened the folder and held up a piece of paper. It was a discharge notice, already stamped and signed, effective immediately. Cancer treatment is expensive, Richard sighed, feigning sympathy. And when a patient has no insurance and outstanding debt, well, it's just bad business to keep them. Unless, of course, a generous donor intervenes. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He was trapped. This wasn't a physical fight he could win with his fists. This was a war of resources, and he was unarmed. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I want you gone." Richard's smile vanished. "Right now. You walk out that door, you tell Elena's father you're a fraud, a con artist who wanted a quick payout. You break her heart so completely that she comes running back to the only stability she has, me." He took a step closer to Marcus. "You do that and your mother's treatment is paid in full for the next year. You refuse, and she's on the street by noon." It was the cruelest checkmate imaginable. Marcus looked back at the closed door of the suite where Elena was finally sleeping peacefully. He thought of her bruise. He thought of her terror. He wanted to stay. He wanted to fight for her. But then he thought of his mother, frail and fighting for every breath in a hospital bed. He couldn't gamble with her life. "Fine," Marcus whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You win." "Smart boy," Richard smirked. "You have 10 minutes. Marcus walked back into the room. It felt like a tomb now. Elena was still asleep, curled up under the duvet, looking younger and softer than the CEO he had met on the plane. She looked safe, and he was about to destroy that safety to save the woman who raised him. He moved silently to the desk. He didn't pack his clothes. He didn't care about them. He took out his wallet. It was worn leather, thin and pathetic. Inside, he had $412, his life savings, everything he had scraped together to get home. He pulled out the crumpled bills. To Richard, this was pocket change. To Elena, it was a tip. But to Marcus, it was his blood and sweat. It was his ability to eat for the next month. He placed the money on the nightstand next to her phone. Then, he grabbed a piece of hotel stationery and wrote 2 lines. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the agony of leaving her behind. "This is everything I have. Use it to run. Don't marry him." He placed the note under the stack of bills. He looked at her one last time, memorizing the curve of her face, the way her hair fell across the pillow. He wanted to kiss her forehead, to tell her the truth, but he couldn't risk waking her. If she woke up, if she looked at him with those eyes, he wouldn't be able to leave. And if he didn't leave, his mother would die. Marcus turned away, his heart fracturing in his chest. He grabbed his bag and walked out the door. He walked past Richard, who was checking his watch with a smug expression. He walked out of the mansion, past the gates and onto the long, dusty road, carrying the crushing weight of a lie that saved a life but destroyed a soul. The drawing room felt less like a home and more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Elena stood in the doorway, her breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at the scene before her. Her parents sat on the velvet sofas, looking vindicated. Richard stood by the fireplace, swirling his drink with a look of triumphant pity. And standing in the center of the Persian rug, looking at the floor, was Marcus. "Tell her," Richard commanded, his voice smooth as silk. Marcus looked up. His eyes were dead, void of the warmth that had filled the guest room only hours ago. He didn't look at Elena's face. He looked at a point just past her shoulder. "I lied," Marcus said, his voice flat and mechanical. "I'm not a consultant. I'm nobody. I have a lot of debt, Elena. Gambling debt. Your fiancé offered to clear it if I left." Elena felt the ground beneath her sway. "What?" she whispered, stepping into the room. "But last night, the shirt, the song, you stayed with me." "It's what you paid for, isn't it?" Marcus said, forcing the words out through a throat that felt like it was filled with broken glass. "You wanted a husband for a day. I gave you the full package, but the contract is up and Richard made a better offer." He shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference that broke her heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Business is business." Elena stared at him. The man who had shielded her at the airport, who had fed her soup, who had hummed her to sleep on a hard floor. It was all a performance? A script? "Get out," Elena whispered. Then she screamed it, her voice tearing with betrayal. Get out! Marcus flinched, the only crack in his mask. He nodded once, turned on his heel, and walked out the French doors. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he saw her crying, he would have turned around and torn Richard apart, and his mother would have paid the price. As the door clicked shut, Elena's father stood up, clapping his hands. Well, tragedy averted. A cheap lesson, Elena, but a necessary one. Never trust the help. The wedding is tonight, Richard announced, stepping forward to put a possessive hand on Elena's shaking shoulder. No more delays. We'll do it here. A private ceremony. Just family. We need to lock down the merger before the market opens tomorrow. Elena didn't fight him. She didn't pull away. The fight had left her the moment Marcus walked out the door. She felt hollow, a shell of a woman. Fine, she said, her voice dead. Do whatever you want. She turned and walked slowly back to the guest suite, moving like a ghost. Inside the room, the silence was deafening. The pillow Marcus had used was still on the floor. The blanket was folded neatly. It smelled like him, like rain and cheap soap. Elena sobbed, a dry, heaving sound, and walked to the nightstand to grab her phone. She wanted to call someone, anyone, but she realized she had no one. That's when she saw it. Underneath her phone was a small, messy stack of cash, crumpled 10s, 20s, a few 1s. It looked pathetic against the marble surface of the table. She frowned, wiping her eyes. She lifted the money. Underneath was a piece of hotel stationery with handwriting that was hurried and jagged. This is everything I have. Use it to run. Don't marry him. Elena froze. She stared at the note, then at the money. She counted it. $412. Why? She whispered to the empty room. If he sold me out for millions, why leave this? Because he didn't sell you out, child. Elena spun around. Grandmother Rose was standing in the doorway, leaning on her cane, her sharp eyes fixed on the money in Elena's hand. The old woman hobbled into the room, taking the note from Elena's trembling fingers. She read it, then looked at the pathetic stack of bills. A con artist takes, Elena, Rose said, her voice firm. He takes as much as he can and he runs. He doesn't leave his life savings on a nightstand. But he said, Elena stammered, confusion warring with hope. He said Richard paid his debts. Richard leveraged his debts, Rose corrected, her eyes narrowing with a terrifying intelligence. I've been watching that snake for years. He doesn't buy people, he blackmails them. She looked down at the money again. $400. That boy is broke. He's desperate. And yet, he left this for you. She looked up at Elena, her expression fierce. Do you understand what this is? This isn't a tip. This is a sacrifice. A man only leaves his last dollar for a woman he is trying to save, not a woman he used. Rose pulled out her phone. She didn't dial a family member. She dialed her private security head, a man loyal only to her. Greggs, she barked. I need you to access the security footage of the hallway outside the guest suite from 10 minutes ago. I want to know exactly what Richard said to that boy before he walked in there. She hung up and looked at Elena, who was clutching the money to her chest, the tears flowing freely now, not of betrayal, but of realization. Dry your eyes, girl, Rose commanded, banging her cane on the floor. We have a wedding to crash. But first we're going to find out what that boy is protecting so badly that he was willing to break his own heart to do it. The private chapel in the east wing of the Kensington estate was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, designed to make humans feel small and God feel distant. Tonight, however, it didn't feel like a house of worship. It felt like a slaughterhouse dressed in silk and white roses. The air was thick, suffocatingly sweet with the scent of thousands of Madonna lilies, flowers usually reserved for funerals, not weddings. 100 guests sat in the pews, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. These were not friends. They were shareholders, business partners, and political allies. They weren't here to witness a union of love. They were here to witness a merger. They sat in respectful silence, checking their watches, eager for the reception champagne, completely indifferent to the tragedy unfolding at the altar. Elena stood at the foot of the marble steps, her hand resting on the arm of her father. She wore a dress that cost more than most people earned in a decade, a custom Vera Wang creation of lace and pearls. But on her, it hung heavy and cold, like a shroud. Her face was a mask of porcelain perfection, makeup artistically applied to hide the puffiness of her eyes and the hollowness of her cheeks. Inside, she was screaming. She was screaming for help, for mercy, for a way out. But outside, she was silent, paralyzed by the threat that hung over her family's legacy. "Smile, Elena," her father whispered, his voice a hiss of irritation as the organ music swelled. "You look like you're marching to the gallows. Richard is watching." Elena looked up. At the end of the aisle, Richard stood waiting. He looked impeccable in a midnight blue tuxedo, his posture arrogant, his smile predatory. He didn't look like a groom waiting for his bride. He looked like a hunter waiting for the trap to snap shut. He caught her eye and winked, a small, terrifying gesture of ownership that made Elena's stomach turn. The music reached a crescendo. The procession began. 1 step, 2 steps. Every step took her further away from the memory of the night before. The warmth of the rug, the smell of rain and cheap soap, the sound of a deep, humming lullaby that had made her feel safe for the first time in her life. That memory felt like a dream now, shattered by the harsh reality of Marcus's betrayal. "He sold me," she thought, the pain sharp and fresh in her chest. "He took the money. He left, just like everyone else." But even as she thought it, her hand brushed against her side where she had hidden the $412 Marcus had left. The bills were crumpled and rough against her skin. Why? The question still haunted her. Why leave everything if you took everything? They reached the altar. Her father handed her over to Richard like a parcel of land. Richard's hand clamped over hers, cold, clammy, and tight. Too tight. He squeezed her fingers, grinding the diamond ring into her skin, a silent reminder of who was in charge. "You made the right choice, darling," Richard whispered in her ear, keeping his smile fixed for the audience. "Tonight, we celebrate. Tomorrow, we restructure the company. And don't worry about your bricklayer friend. I'm sure he's enjoying his 30 pieces of silver." The priest, a man who had clearly been paid double his usual fee to rush the ceremony, cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Elena zoned out. The world blurred into a gray haze. She stared at the stained glass window behind the priest, wishing she could fly through it and disappear, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Time seemed to slow down. Every beat of her heart was a hammer against her ribs. "If anyone here has just cause why these two should not be joined," the priest droned on, his eyes scanning the bored crowd out of habit, "speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence. The only sound was the rustling of fabric and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Elena closed her eyes. This was it. The end. Suddenly, the heavy silence was shattered. The massive oak doors at the back of the chapel groaned against their hinges, a heavy, dragging sound that cut through the silence. Then, with a sudden violent force, they crashed against the walls, the impact echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. Heads turned, whispers broke out. Richard frowned, looking over Elena's shoulder with annoyance. Elena turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness of the night outside, was a figure. He was panting, his chest heaving up and down as if he had run a marathon. His clothes were a mess, his cheap shirt was soaked with sweat, his boots were covered in mud, and his hair was wild. It was Marcus. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a wreck. But as he stepped into the light of the nave, his eyes were burning with a fire that made the crystal chandeliers look dim. "Stop!" Marcus rasped. His voice was hoarse, broken, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. Richard laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that cut through the tension. "Security!" he barked, not even stepping down from the altar. "Get this trash out of here! I thought I told you to throw him off the property!" 2 large security guards in black suits stepped out from the shadows, moving toward Marcus. "Don't touch me!" Marcus yelled, holding up a hand. There was something in his voice, a raw, desperate authority that made the guards hesitate for a fraction of a second. Marcus ignored them. He walked down the aisle. He didn't walk with the swagger of a rich man. He walked with the heavy, determined stomp of a man who had nothing left to lose. He walked past the shocked faces of the shareholders. He walked past Elena's furious father. He didn't stop until he was 10 feet from the altar. He looked at Elena. Just her. He stripped away the dress, the diamonds, the fear, and looked right at the woman who had cried in his arms the night before. "I didn't take the money," Marcus said. He was breathless, his voice shaking. "I didn't take a dime." "Get him out!" Richard screamed, his face turning red. "He's deranged! He's a stalker!" "I left because he threatened my mother," Marcus shouted over him, turning to face the crowd, pointing an accusatory finger at Richard. "He told me he bought the hospital where she's being treated. He said if I didn't leave, he'd cancel her care and transfer her to a state facility with no specialists. He used my dying mother as leverage to force me out of this room." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The polite society guests began to murmur. This was too raw, too ugly for their refined sensibilities. Richard stepped down from the altar, abandoning his bride to confront the intruder. He moved into Marcus's space, using his height and his expensive suit to intimidate. "You have an active imagination, bricklayer," Richard sneered, his voice low and venomous. "But nobody cares about your sob story. You're a nobody. You're dirt. And now you've made a very expensive mistake." Richard pulled out his phone. He held it up so Marcus could see the screen. He dialed a number. "St. Mary's Hospital Billing Department," Richard announced, his thumb hovering over the call button. "Let's finish what we started, shall we? I think it's time your mother was transferred to a state facility where she'll get the bare minimum care she deserves." Elena screamed. "Richard, no! Don't!" Marcus lunged forward, but the two security guards grabbed him. They pinned his arms back, holding him helpless. Marcus struggled, his muscles straining, veins popping in his neck, but he couldn't break free. He watched in horror as Richard pressed the call button, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Say goodbye, Marcus," Richard taunted, putting the phone to his ear. "Hello? Yes, this is Richard Sterling. I'm calling regarding patient Sarah Miller. I want to cancel all—" "Put the phone down, Richard." The voice didn't come from the altar. It came from the front pew. It was a voice that sounded like grinding rocks, old, brittle, but unbreakable. Grandmother Rose stood up. She didn't look frail tonight. She looked like a queen who had just decided to order an execution. She leaned heavily on her cane, driving it into the marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic cadence that commanded attention. Richard lowered the phone slowly, annoyed. "Rose, please. I'm handling a security breach. Sit down." "I said put it down," Rose repeated, her voice rising to a command that brooked no argument. "You can't cancel Sarah Miller's treatment." "And why is that?" Richard challenged, his arrogance blinding him to the danger. "Because you say so?" "No," Rose said calmly, walking into the center aisle to stand between Marcus and Richard. "Because the bill has already been paid." Richard blinked. "What?" "I paid it," Rose announced. She turned to Marcus, her eyes softening with profound respect. "Full coverage, private room, top specialists, paid in full for the next 5 years. I did it 10 minutes ago." Marcus slumped in the guard's grip, the relief washing over him so violently his knees almost buckled. Tears streamed down his face, tears of a son who had carried the weight of the world for too long and finally found someone to help him lift it. Rose turned back to Richard. The softness vanished from her eyes. "You think you're smart, Richard?" Rose asked, pulling her own phone from her clutch. "You think because we are old money we are stupid? I saw the note Marcus left. I saw the $400. And I knew. A man doesn't leave his life savings for a woman he betrayed." She tapped her screen and held it up. A video was playing. It was grainy black and white footage from a security camera. It showed the hallway outside the guest suite. It showed Richard cornering Marcus. It showed him handing over the hospital discharge papers. The audio was crisp and clear. "It's just bad business to keep them, unless a generous donor intervenes." The audio echoed through the silent chapel. Every guest heard it. Every shareholder heard the callousness, the blackmail, the cruelty. "Embezzlement," Rose listed the crimes, ticking them off on her fingers. "You used the hospital acquisition fund to cover your gambling debts in Macau. I've been auditing your accounts all morning while you were getting your hair done. You're not just a bully, Richard. You're a thief. And you are broke. The word hung in the air. Broke. Richard's face went from red to a ghostly white. The murmurs in the crowd turned into open hostility. His power, the only thing he had, evaporated in seconds. This is a fabrication, Richard stammered, backing away. She's senile! She's lying! He turned to his security guards, the men holding Marcus. Get them out! Arrest her! I pay your salaries! The guards looked at Richard. Then they looked at Rose. Then they looked at Marcus. Slowly, deliberately, they released Marcus's arms. They stepped back, crossing their arms over their chests, leaving Richard standing alone. You're fired, Richard, Rose said, delivering the final blow. From the board, from the company, and from this family. Richard looked around. He saw the disgust on the faces of the elite. He saw the triumph in Marcus's eyes. He saw the freedom on Elena's face. Something inside him snapped. The narcissist couldn't handle the injury. If he was going down, he was going to break something on the way. He turned to Elena. She was the cause of this. She was the one who brought the stray dog home. You, Richard hissed, his eyes wide and manic. You ungrateful little witch! You set me up! He lunged at her. It was fast, violent, and pathetic. He raised his hand, aiming a vicious backhand slap at Elena's face, intending to mark her one last time, to show everyone he still owned her. Elena flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the pain. But it never came. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud, a brutal collision of bone against bone that silenced the entire room. Elena opened her eyes. Richard was not standing in front of her. He was on the floor, 10 feet away, sliding across the polished marble like a rag doll. Blood appeared on his split lip as he tumbled backward. Standing in front of Elena was Marcus. His right fist was still raised, smoke practically rising from his knuckles. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his entire body radiating a protective fury that was terrifying to behold. He hadn't just blocked the slap. He had delivered a counterpunch fueled by 10 years of watching his mother suffer, fueled by the injustice of the world, fueled by every moment he had felt helpless. Marcus walked over to where Richard lay groaning, trying to push himself up. Marcus grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo and hauled him up to his knees. You don't touch her, Marcus growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. You don't look at her. You don't speak her name. If I ever see you near her again, there will be serious consequences. Do you understand? Richard nodded weakly, his eyes filled with genuine terror for the first time in his life. Police! The doors burst open again. 6 officers in tactical gear swarmed the aisle. Rose had timed this perfectly. That's him! Rose pointed at Richard with her cane. Richard Sterling, fraud, embezzlement, blackmail, and add assault to the list. As the officers cuffed Richard, dragging him, kicking and screaming about his lawyers, out of the chapel, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The tension broke. The wedding was over. Elena didn't watch him go. She didn't care about the guests or her parents or the scandal. She only saw one thing. She ran. She gathered up the heavy folds of her $10,000 dress and ran toward the man in the dirty, sweat-stained shirt. Marcus! He turned just in time to catch her. She collided with him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground, holding her tight. He smelled of sweat and dirt and adrenaline. And to Elena, it was the sweetest perfume she had ever smelled. It was the smell of reality, the smell of safety. You came back, she sobbed into his neck, ruining his shirt for the second time and not caring a bit. You came back! I couldn't leave you, Marcus whispered into her hair, closing his eyes, letting the adrenaline fade into exhaustion. I promised. No one goes through that door tonight. The guests, the elite, the billionaires, people who had never clapped for anything other than a rising stock price, slowly began to stand. One by one, then in groups, and suddenly the chapel was filled with applause. Not polite applause, real, thunderous applause. They weren't clapping for the merger. They were clapping for the bricklayer who had knocked out a tyrant. They were clapping because for one brief moment in their artificial lives, they had witnessed something real. Grandmother Rose watched them embrace, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. She tapped her cane once, decisively. "Now," she murmured to herself, "that is a wedding." 3 days later, the morning sun flooded the cabin of the private jet, turning the cream leather seats into gold. It was the same plane, the same seat, but the air inside was completely different. The suffocating tension of their first meeting had vanished, replaced by a lightness that felt like freedom. Marcus sat in seat 1A, staring out at the clouds. He wasn't wearing his frayed work shirt or his muddy boots. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, a personal gift from Grandmother Rose, who had insisted that her new director of charitable foundations look the part. He ran a hand over the expensive fabric of his sleeve, still adjusting to the strange sensation of not carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You look good in navy." Marcus turned. Elena stood in the aisle holding 2 glasses of champagne. She looked radiant. The shadows of fear that had haunted her eyes were gone, replaced by a sparkling, defiant joy. She wasn't the trembling victim anymore. She was a woman who had fought for her life and won. "I still feel like I'm wearing a costume," Marcus admitted, taking the glass she offered. "I'm just a bricklayer, Elena. I don't know if I fit in this world." "You don't fit in," Elena smiled, sliding into the seat next to him, closing the distance between them until their knees touched. "You stand out. That's the point." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver tube. Marcus recognized it immediately. It was the lipstick, the bright, dangerous shade of red that had started everything. Elena uncapped it, twisting the base until the crimson color appeared. She looked at Marcus with a playful yet deeply intense gaze. "You know," she whispered, leaning in close, her voice dropping to a sultry murmur. "Technically, you never finished your contract. You promised to be my husband until we were safe." "We are safe now," Marcus said softly, getting lost in her eyes. "Are we?" Elena teased. She leaned forward, her hand resting gently on his chest, right over his heart. With deliberate, slow precision, she pressed her lips against the pristine white collar of his brand-new dress shirt. She pulled back, leaving a perfect, indelible red mark. Marcus looked down at the stain, a symbol that used to mean scandal, but now meant salvation. He looked up at her and grinned. "You just ruined another shirt, boss." "I know," Elena laughed, interlacing her fingers with his. "But I think this one is my favorite. Consider it a down payment. I hear the position of husband is now open for a permanent applicant." Marcus leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think I can clear my schedule." As the plane banked toward the horizon, carrying them toward a future they chose together, the camera lingers on the red lipstick stain, a badge of honor on a hero's chest. Sometimes the richest person in the room isn't the one with the biggest bank account. It is the one who is willing to spend their last dollar to protect a stranger. True love isn't found in perfect moments. It is found in the messy, broken ones where we decide to stay. Because in the end, love is the only currency that truly matters.